At 2:14 in the morning, the lights inside the Vatican Apostolic Archive went out, because Pope Leo XIV had ordered darkness. He stood alone in a corridor. Most living cardinals had never entered with a sealed red envelope resting in his hands. The wax had not been broken in more than 26 years, and when he finally opened it, the silence around him became heavier than the walls. The file was tied to the third secret of Fatima, one of the most sensitive spiritual mysteries in modern Catholic history. It was not simply a prophecy. It was a wound the Vatican had declared closed, filed away, explained to the world, and left behind. But as Leo read the pages under the controlled light of a single desk lamp, the color drained from his face. There was no public alarm that night. No bell rang across St. Peter's Square. No Vatican spokesman appeared before cameras. Yet inside the archive, the Pope had seen enough to understand that the Church had not only guarded a secret, it had managed a story. What Leo did in the next 72 hours would move through the Apostolic Palace like a pressure wave. Schedules would vanish. Cardinals would be summoned without warning. A 12-page letter would be drafted before dawn, and the Vatican would be forced to face a question it had avoided for decades. Did the Church reveal the truth, or only the version it believed the faithful could survive? 3 days earlier, the Vatican had looked calm from the outside. Pope Leo XIV had just returned from his apostolic journey to Spain after 7 days across Madrid, Barcelona, Montserrat, and the Canary Islands. The trip had carried the rhythm of a confident pontificate, massive crowds pressing against barricades, long applause inside the Sagrada Familia, and a warm reception from King Felipe. Even the disruption on the return flight had turned into a public success. When a mechanical failure grounded the original aircraft, Leo accepted an unplanned ride home on the Spanish king's plane, and the image traveled quickly through Catholic media. Reporters who had followed him through Spain described a pope settling into his office with unusual ease, relaxed enough to joke about Spanish food and steady, enough to make the pressure around him look manageable. His staff expected him to rest when he returned to the Apostolic Palace. He had been traveling for more than a week, and his schedule had been cleared for the next 2 days. The corridors around the papal apartment quieted into the ordinary rhythm of recovery after a major journey, with secretaries reducing calls, aides lowering voices, and Vatican officials assuming the Pope would not reopen business until he had slept. Then, on the evening of June 14th, the atmosphere changed. At 7:32 in the evening, Leo received a private call from an old friend, a retired archbishop in Laria, who had known Robert Faust since his years as an Augustinian in Peru. The conversation lasted only 14 minutes, but one passing detail inside it struck the Pope with enough force to empty the room of calm. The archbishop mentioned an academic conference taking place in Portugal. A historian there had presented a new analysis of how the Vatican had handled the Fatima dossier internally across several pontificates, not by revealing new secrets, but by reconstructing the way successive administrations shaped the public narrative around the third secret for more than 60 years. It sounded like academic material, distant, and when the call ended, he did not immediately speak. He sat in silence for nearly 20 minutes, while the room around him remained untouched. The desk still arranged, the evening schedule still waiting, the trip to Spain still officially the story of the week. Father Marco Benedetti, his personal secretary, noticed the change before anyone else did. The ease from Spain had disappeared, and in its place was the stillness of a man who had heard a question he could no longer put down. At 9:47 that night, Pope Leo XIV did not ask for a briefing note. He summoned Monsieur Adriano Ferro, the newly appointed prefect of the Vatican Apostolic Archive. The call moved through the papal household with unusual speed, and within less than 20 minutes, Ferro arrived. At the Apostolic Palace, still in civilian clothes, as if he had been pulled out of an ordinary evening and dropped into something older than protocol. He found Leo standing at the window of the private study, looking toward the darkened dome of St. Peter's. The Pope did not turn around when Ferro entered. He gave one instruction, quiet and exact. He needed to see everything related to the third secret of Fatima. Not the published version, everything. The words landed without. Decoration. And Ferro understood immediately that this was not curiosity. Popes had full authority over the archive, so the request itself was not unlawful, not even extraordinary on paper. What unsettled Ferro was the tone. Leo sounded like a man who was not searching for a document, but confirming a suspicion that had already formed in his mind. The prefect left without argument. Behind him, the study door closed, and the ordinary machinery of the Vatican began to move in silence. Archive access was arranged, the necessary F each archive access was arranged. The necessary files were located, and the old Fatima material began its passage back toward the papal apartment under security conditions few outside that world would ever see. The question had now become operational. It was no longer a passing remark from a retired archbishop or an academic conference in Portugal. It had entered the archive, and once a pope asks an archive for everything, the institution has to decide how much of itself it is prepared to show. 2 hours later, Pharaoh returned carrying a secured metal case. It was not large, but the way he held it changed the room before it opened. Inside were 3 separate files, each one connected to Fatima, each one preserved under a different layer of institutional memory. The first file was the one the world already knew. It contained the vision published by the Vatican in the year 2000 under Pope John Paul II. The image of a bishop dressed in white, moving through a ruined city before being struck down near a large cross. That version had been presented as the long-awaited disclosure, the official closing of a mystery that had followed the Church through the 20th century. The second file was different. It contained internal Vatican analyses written across decades by successive officials, connected to the congregation for the doctrine of the faith. These were not documents meant for devotional reading or public explanation. They were institutional readings, cautious, layered, technical, and shaped by men who understood both the power of Fatima and the danger of letting it speak too freely. The third file was the one that made Pharaoh hesitate. He himself had never opened it. It was a sealed personal memorandum, handwritten, addressed to no specific recipient, bearing no date and no signature, with only one line written at the top in Portuguese. The lack of formal identity made it more unsettling, not less, because inside Vatican archives, anonymity can sometimes protect what authority cannot safely name. Leo opened the known file first, then the internal analyses, then the sealed memorandum. Pharaoh would later tell his closest aide that when the Pope reached the third file, the atmosphere in the study seemed to change temperature, not physically, emotionally. The determination on Leo's face gave way to something deeper and more dangerous. The expression of a man who had not discovered a rumor, but recognized a grief. Pope Leo XIV spent the next 4 hours reading alone. No aide entered the study. No secretary was allowed through the door. The metal case remained open on the desk, while the 3 files lay spread before him like 3 versions of the same wound. What had been shown, what had been discussed, and what had been left sealed. At 4:30 in the morning, Pharaoh was called back. He entered quietly and found the Pope still at the desk, his glasses removed, his eyes red from reading, and the papers arranged with the precision of a man who had stopped looking for comfort. Leo looked up and spoke 6 words that Pharaoh would never forget. They had been hiding too long. Pharaoh asked whether the Pope needed water, coffee, or time alone. Leo refused all of it with a small movement of his head. What he needed was a list. Every person in the institution who had been involved in the decision to present the third secret to the press in the year 2000, every advisor, every drafter, every editor, every hand that had touched the shape of what the world was allowed to see. The request made Pharaoh stop. Many of those figures were no longer alive, and some had been gone for years. Leo already knew that, and his answer cut through the room without force. Some were dead, some were retired, and some were sitting in offices 50 miles from where they stood. So Pharaoh was to begin with the living. It was not a question anymore. It was an instruction from a pope who had spent 14 months learning the internal habits of the Vatican and had just found those habits written into the handling of Fatima. The secret itself had disturbed him, but the system around the secret had done something worse. The morning of June 15th arrived with a kind of pressure the Vatican could feel before it could name. Staff members saw it first in the calendar. Pope Leo XIV candled the entire day. No audiences, no diplomatic meetings, no courtesy calls, no routine briefings, and no recovery schedule after Spain. Only one instruction remained with Father Marco Benedetti. He was to arrange an emergency meeting with 6 specific cardinals, not the familiar advisors who usually surrounded a new pope, and not the men Rome expected him to consult in moments of public difficulty. These were cardinals chosen because they knew the institution from the inside. Men who had served under John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis, men old enough to remember which doors had been closed and why. The meeting was set for 3 in the afternoon inside the Salonia, a rarely used conference room deep within the Apostolic Palace. When the 6 cardinals arrived, Leo was already seated at the head of the long mahogany table. There was no coffee, no informal exchange, no soft entrance into the subject. Only the Pope's hand indicating that they should sit. Leo told them he had spent the night reading the full internal record on the third secret of Fatima and that he had questions. The silence came at once. Cardinal Thomas Gutierrez, 81 years old, shifted in his chair because he had been a young man senior in the Secretariat of State. When John Paul II first read the secret in 1981 after the assassination attempt in St. Peter's Square, Leo walked them through the public version without raising his voice. In the year 2000, the Vatican had told the world that the third secret was a symbolic vision of persecution and martyrdom tied largely to the violent tragedies of the 20th century. Cardinal Ratzinger had presented it to the press, saying there was nothing apocalyptic in the text, and that the secret belonged essentially to the past. Then Leo placed the weight of the internal files on the table. The analyses he had read did not support such clean closure. Across multiple pontificates, different Vatican readers had raised concerns that the public framing was too narrow, that context had been withheld, and that the published interpretation had been shaped to end questions rather than answer them. Gutierrez tried to defend the old handling of the file. He began with the careful phrase that those analyses were never meant to be made public. Leo cut him off before the sentence could become a shield, asking whether they were not meant to be read by a pope, by the man responsible for the church itself. The room did not recover quickly. What Leo had found was not a second prophecy and not some dramatic hidden text placed behind a forbidden seal. It was more damaging because it was institutional, a pattern of reducing Fatima into a controlled narrative, a way of protecting the church from questions about corruption, abuse, financial scandal, failed leadership, and the possibility that the vision of the bishop in white was not only about one gunshot in 1980. That was what angered him. Not the mystery, not the devotion, not even the old fear around Fatima. The church had taken a moment of spiritual reckoning, pressed it into the shape of a press conference, neutralized its danger, and filed it away as if closure were the same thing as truth. By the evening of June 15th, word had begun to leak through the Vatican without anyone needing to speak plainly. 6 cardinals had been summoned without notice. The Pope's public schedule had disappeared. The prefect of the Apostolic Archive had moved secured Fatima files into the papal apartment. And in a city built on controlled silence, that kind of movement was already a statement. The first open reaction came from Cardinal Pietro Mancini, the powerful head of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. He had not been invited to the meeting in the Sala Bologna, and he understood the exclusion immediately. At 8:00 that night, he reached Leo's secretary and demanded to speak with the Pope directly. Father Benedetti carried the message into the papal study. Leo did not take the call. His answer was brief enough to become its own warning. Tell the cardinal he would speak with him when he was ready. Mancini was stunned. He had served under 3 popes, and men in his position were not usually left waiting outside. Decisions involving doctrine, archives, Fatima, and public interpretation. But Leo was no longer organizing the crisis around curial rank. He was organizing it around trust. Inside the study, the Pope had already begun drafting a document. It was not a decree, not an encyclical, not a technical note for theologians. It was a letter addressed to the entire church, and its purpose was more dangerous than revealing a hidden prophecy. Leo intended to acknowledge publicly that the Vatican's handling of the third secret of Fatima had been insufficient. He wanted to say that the internal record showed a pattern of institutional self-P protection, one that had placed the church's image above its spiritual mission. He would not claim that the old presentation had been false, but he would say it had been controlled. That distinction was enough to divide the building. If Leo spoke, the Vatican would not only reopen Fatima, it would reopen the deeper question of how often the institution had treated truth as something to be managed before it reached the faithful. The night of June 15th did not end inside the Sala Bologna. After the 6 cardinals left, Pope Leo XIV remained in the Apostolic Palace with 2 people he trusted enough to let near the first draft. Archbishop Elena Rossetti, his chief of communications, arrived with a folder of press risk assessments, and Father James Callahan, an American Austinian who had served as Leo's personal theologian since before the conclave, came with no folder at all. The letter took shape slowly. Leo worked until nearly 3 in the morning, revising line after line, while the Vatican around him moved into that narrow hour when even powerful buildings seemed to stop breathing. It would be written first in English, then translated immediately into Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, German, and Polish. Because if the church was going to speak about truth, Leo did not want the message delayed by language. Rossetti warned him first. Any public statement about Fatima would reignite decades of conspiracy theories, pull fringe voices back into the center of Catholic conversation, and give secular media a story they could twist beyond recognition. Leo listened without impatience, then answered that the fringe groups already believed the church was hiding something because, in this case, the institution had been hiding too much. That stopped her. Rossetti had spent years protecting the Vatican from public misinterpretation, but Leo was no longer asking how the statement would be used against him. He was asking what the church had already done against its own credibility. Callahan raised the second warning. The Pope had just returned from Spain. The Society of St. Pass, the 10th crisis, was moving toward illicit ordinations on July 1st, and the Vatican was already carrying one internal fire. Opening Fatima now could create another front before the first had been contained. Leo stood and walked to the window where he had stood the night before, looking again toward the dark dome of St. Peter's. His answer came quietly, with no theater in it. There was never a right moment for the truth, he told Callahan, and that was exactly why it kept being delayed. By dawn on June 16th, the letter was finished. It ran 12 pages and carried instructions for simultaneous translation into 7 languages. But Leo did not release it. Not yet. Before the church could read what he had written, he needed to make one call and face one man. At 7:30 on the morning of June 16th, before the Vatican's ordinary workday had settled into its rhythm, Pope Leo XIV placed a private phone call to the Bishop of Fatima in Portugal. The conversation lasted 41 minutes. No official record was kept, but sources close to the bishop later confirmed that Leo requested something no pope had ever requested in quite that way. He wanted a private, closed-D door or ceremony at the Chapel of the Apparitions in Fatima. No cameras, no crowd, no choreographed arrival, no public devotion staged for the world. Only the pope, the bishop, the chapel, and the history that had followed the church for more than a century. The bishop agreed immediately. Then Leo did something that caught even his closest aides off guard. Instead of leaving directly for his regular Tuesday visit to Castel Gandolfo, he ordered his driver to take him to the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, without an appointment and without advanced notice. At 8:15 in the morning, Leo walked into Cardinal Pietro Mancini's office. Mancini had no time to prepare the room, call an aide, or shape the meeting through protocol. He later told a colleague that the encounter lasted exactly 11 minutes and that the Pope never sat down. Leo stood in the center of the office with his hands clasped behind his back. He told Mancini that he knew the cardinal was concerned that he believed the Fatima matter had been settled 26 years earlier and that he thought the Pope was making a mistake. When Mancini began to answer, Leo raised one hand and ended the attempt before it became an argument. He had not come for Mancini's opinion. He had come to inform him that in the coming days he would release a public statement on the Church's handling of the third secret. It would not reveal classified material, and it would not endorse conspiracy theories, but it would acknowledge what the internal record already showed. The institution had chosen comfort over candor. Mancini sat in silence for 10 full seconds. Then he warned that such a statement could destabilize the entire Curia. Leo looked at him without moving and gave one answer, controlled and cold enough to empty the office of air. Perhaps it needed destabilizing. The cardinal tried one final defense. He said the faithful would be confused and would think the church had lied. Leo's jaw tightened and his voice softened without losing force. The church had not told them the full truth, he said. It had told them what it decided they could handle, and that was not the same thing. Mancini had nothing left that could stop him. Leo turned and walked out, leaving the office before the cardinal could rebuild the old language around the crisis. The confrontation had lasted 11 minutes, but by the time the Pope entered the car for Castel Gandolfo, the line inside the Vatican had already been drawn. The drive to Castel Gandolfo took 45 minutes. Pope Leo XIV sat in the back of the car and looked through the window without speaking. His security detail noticed that he was not anxious or tense, only unusually still, like a man who had made a decision so large that ordinary conversation no longer had a place beside it. At Castel Gandolfo, the morning moved around him, but he did not enter it easily. The Villa Barberini was undergoing renovations for his summer use, with workers reshaping rooms that had become museum spaces under Francis and preparing them to be lived in again. Leo watched the work for a while as if the sound of walls being changed carried some private meaning, then withdrew into a small chapel inside the villa. He prayed there for more than an hour. No aides stood beside him. No secretary brought papers. The Pope remained alone with whatever he had read in the archive 2 nights earlier, and whatever he had just told Mancini in that office at the dicaster for the doctrine of the faith. When he emerged, his face was calm but distant. He walked the gardens alone, stopping near a stone bench that overlooked the Alban Hills. A gardener working nearby later said the Pope stood there for several minutes without moving, then bent down, picked up a small stone from the pathway, turned it over in his hand, and placed it in his pocket. The gardener had worked at the villa for 23 years and had never seen a pope do that. When he mentioned it to his supervisor, the answer came with the plainness of someone who had watched powerful men become human in quiet places. Popes were men, he said, and men did strange things when they were carrying heavy thoughts. At 4 in the afternoon, another car arrived at the gates. It carried Cardinal Luis Fernando Herrera, a Colombian cardinal and one of Leo's closest allies in the College of Cardinals. Herrera had not been summoned. He had come because the rumors from the previous day had reached him, and he knew enough about Leo to understand that silence from him could mean more than anger. The 2 men walked together through the gardens for nearly 90 minutes. No official record was made of the conversation, but Herrera later gave one sentence to a Brazilian journalist that revealed the emotional temperature of the afternoon. He said he had known Robert Faust for more than 30 years, had seen him face pressure, criticism, and threats, but had never seen him look as he looked that day. Herrera said Leo was not afraid. He was resolved, and resolution in a man like him was far more dangerous than anger. By Tuesday evening, Leo stopped to speak with journalists waiting outside the Castel Gandolfo residence. It was one of his informal sidewalk press conferences, a habit that had already begun to separate his papacy from the tightly controlled communication style of previous pontificates. He answered questions about Spain, the Iran-United States ceasefire, and the Society of St. Pius the X crisis with warmth, patience, and flashes of humor. Then a reporter asked about the rumors that he had spent the night in the Vatican archives, reading documents connected to Fatima. Leo smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. He said he spent many nights reading because that was part of the job, then added that some things in the Church's history deserved more than a footnote, and some footnotes deserved to be read more carefully than the main text. The reporters pressed for more. Leo did not give it. He only told them they would understand soon enough. Then entered the car and returned to the Vatican, leaving behind a sentence that was too controlled to be accidental. That night, the Vatican press office began receiving calls from the Associated Press, Reuters, the British Broadcasting Corporation, and Al-Azhar. Every outlet was asking the same question. Was the Pope preparing a public statement about the third secret of Fatima? The press office, caught off guard, gave the only answer it had, saying there were no announcements to make at the time. Inside the Apostolic Palace, the answer was already obsolete. Cardinal Mancini had spent the afternoon making calls, not to journalists, but to other cardinals. He was building resistance not against papal authority openly, but against what he believed was a decision that could throw the Curia Fatima and the credibility of the year 2000 presentation into chaos. Mancini's argument was not absurd. Reopening the Fatima question could empower conspiracy theorists, damage the memory of Ratzinger's presentation, and hand the world a story about decades of Vatican dishonesty. But Leo was no longer focused on whether there was a hidden second text or a suppressed prophecy. He was focused on the reflex beneath it all, the instinct to manage truth, to control information, to decide for more than 1 billion believers what they were strong enough to know. To Leo, Fatima had become the symbol of that reflex, the moment when the Church could have spoken with radical honesty and instead chose strategic carefulness. On the morning of June 17th, Pope Leo XIV stepped into St. Peter's Square for the weekly general audience. As if the machinery around him had not begun to tremble, thousands of pilgrims had gathered beneath the open sky, many still carrying the glow of his return from Spain. The prepared remarks were ordinary, pastoral, and safe. Gratitude for the Spanish people, the beauty of the Sagrada Familia, the spiritual force of Antoni Gaudi's vision, and the memory of crowds that had received him with warmth. Then, near the end, Leo set the text aside. The movement was small, but the square felt it. He looked out across the pilgrims, past the flags, past the cameras, past the officials who had not been warned, and began speaking without notes about the relationship between the Church and truth. He did not begin with doctrine. He did not begin with prophecy. He spoke of simple human truth, the kind that admits a mistake, the kind that says an institution could have done better, the kind that owes honesty even when honesty becomes uncomfortable. The square fell into a silence so complete that the shift could be seen before it could be heard. Leo said the Church he led was not perfect, and had never been perfect, but it had to be. Honest, because a Church that hides from its own history cannot lead its people into the future. Then he announced that in the coming weeks he would address certain moments in recent Church history where the institution had placed its image above its integrity, not to condemn those who came before him, but to honor the faithful who deserve to trust the Church they loved. The words moved through the square with the force of something already irreversible. Leo's voice lowered. Slightly when he reached the line that would travel farther than anything else, he said that morning. This Church would not hide anymore. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then the applause began near the front, where a group of young pilgrims from Mexico had been standing since dawn. It spread outward through the square against Bernini's colonnade, across the flags and into the press section until the entire space was on its feet. Leo stood without triumph. His hands remained folded before him, and his face did not carry the expression of a man enjoying approval. It was the face of a man who had just crossed a public line and understood that applause would end long before the consequences did. 2 rows behind the press section. Father James Callahan watched with admiration and dread. He knew the cameras would cut away, the crowd would disperse, and the sound in the square would fade. The real storm would begin inside the walls where applause meant nothing and power still knew how to defend itself. Inside the Vatican, Cardinal Mancini watched the general audience from his office window and made the first move before the square had fully emptied. He called an emergency meeting with 5 senior Curia officials. The meeting lasted 3 hours. No minutes were taken. And 2 participants later confirmed that the word intervention was used, not in a canonical sense, but in the political one. They did not intend to challenge Leo's authority openly. That would have been unthinkable. They wanted to slow him down, soften the statement, widen the consultations, and force the Pope to treat Fatima as a matter that required more institutional management before it became public truth. By evening, they had drafted a letter. 5 cardinals signed it, each one respected, each one powerful, each one warning that Leo's course could confuse the faithful and destabilize the Curia. At 7:00 that night, the letter was delivered to the papal study while Leo ate, dinner alone. The meal was simple, pasta and water, his usual habit. Leo read the cardinal's letter without interrupting the rhythm of the room. When he finished, he folded it neatly and placed it inside the same metal case Pharaoh had carried from the archive 3 days earlier. Then he called Archbishop Elena Rossetti. His instruction was quiet and final. Release the letter the next morning, all languages simultaneously. Rossetti hesitated because the cardinals had now put their concern in writing, but Leo had already decided that concern was not conviction, and conviction was what the moment required. On June 18th, at 6 in the morning, Rome time, Pope Leo XIV's letter appeared on the Vatican website in 7 languages at once. It was 12 pages long, and within 1 hour, it became the most viewed document in the site's history. Within 2 hours, the world's major news networks were no longer asking whether the Pope would speak about Fatima. They were reading what he had already said. The letter did not reveal a hidden prophecy. It did not claim the Vatican had lied about the third secret. It did something more controlled and, for that reason, more devastating. It acknowledged that Fatima had been handled too often as a public relations matter, rather than a pastoral one, and that the internal record showed legitimate questions had been left unanswered. Leo named the pattern without theatrics. He called it the reflex of protection, or the instinct to shield the institution from scrutiny even when the cost was the faithful's trust. He wrote that under his pontificate, that reflex would be challenged at every level because closure without honesty was not peace, it was management. The reaction was immediate and divided. Supporters called it one of the most honest papal statements since the Second Vatican Council. Critics called it reckless. The Society of St. Pius X claimed vindication within hours. Liberal Catholic groups praised the transparency, and conservative commentators warned that Leo had opened a door no pope could easily close. The most important reaction came from inside the Vatican. Cardinal Pietro Mancini requested an immediate private audience, and Leo granted it for 2 hours that afternoon in the papal study. Mancini arrived with 7 objections prepared, theological, political, and practical, and he spoke for nearly 40 minutes while Leo listened without interruption. When Mancini finished, Leo did not dismiss the risks. He told him the confusion was real, the critics would use the letter, and the work of governing would become harder. Then he told the cardinal what mattered more. People could forgive mistakes, but they could not forgive being treated like children for decades. Leo said the institution had decided what the faithful could handle. It had curated their reality, and the faithful had noticed. The letter was not written to settle every theological debate around Fatima. It was written because more than 1 billion Catholics deserved a pope who respected them enough to tell the truth, especially when truth was uncomfortable. Mancini asked what would happen if this brought the whole structure down. Leo met his eyes and answered that they would build a better one. When Mancini left the study, he looked like a man who had lost an argument he had been certain he would win. 2 hours later, Mancini issued a public statement expressing full support for the Pope's letter and admiration for Leo's commitment to transparency. Those who knew him understood what it meant. It was not agreement. It was surrender. That evening, Leo returned to his private chapel and knelt for more than 30 minutes. When he emerged, Father James Callahan was waiting in the hallway and asked how he felt. Leo looked at him with something close to peace and said he felt like a man who had stopped carrying something that was never his to carry. The truth belonged to everyone. Leo told him the moment the church forgot that it stopped, being itself. Then he asked Callahan to call the bishop of Laria Fatima and tell him the visit was still on, but that he was not coming to close a chapter. He was coming to open one. In the days that followed, the shock moved beyond Rome. Newspapers across 5 continents ran front-page stories. Theologians published analyses, and priests in ordinary parishes found themselves answering questions, not only about Fatima, but about trust. In Buenos Aires, a young priest read the letter aloud during evening mass, and half the church was in tears before he reached the end. In Manila, Catholic university students organized a candlelight vigil in support of Leo's call for transparency. In Chicago, a retired Manchur told a local radio station that Leo had done what 3 popes before him had been afraid to do. He had told the truth about the truth. The resistance hardened. At the same time, anonymous flyers appeared on the desks of several Curia officials in Rome, warning that the letter marked the beginning of the end of papal authority. Conservative outlets called it an act of self-destruction. And in private dining rooms across the Eternal City, powerful men in red robes debated whether this pope had gone too far or had only just begun. Leo did not retreat. He did not clarify. He did not soften the letter with a second statement designed to calm the men who had been shaken by the first. He allowed the document to stand, and by allowing it to stand, he made the deeper message unmistakable. Under his leadership, truth would no longer be treated as something to be managed before it reached the faithful. For his supporters, it was the defining moment of his papacy. For his opponents, it was the beginning of a fight they could not yet measure. And for Catholics watching from every corner of the earth, it was something simpler and more dangerous than both. The Church had looked them in the eye and admitted that it owed them better.